Thanks a lot for your invitation to join you here today, this morning. My case study also draws on the Internet corpus built as part of the Genealogies of Knowledge project. In presenting their case study, Henry and Jan have already outlined the rationale for the compilation of corpus, and they've also provided a general overview of what it holds. So I'll start by noting that unlike their case study, mine focuses on outlets and texts that contest key concepts underpinning established scientific discourse and their role in the production and the circulation of evidence and knowledge. So obviously, the two areas within the Internet corpus are interlinked and they are related in many ways, but my paper will focus on an aspect of that Internet corpus, which is slightly complementary to the one that they have already been speaking about. In compiling this subset of the Internet corpus, we try to ensure that voices resisting traditional forms of expertise or advocating the use of alternative forms of evidence in policy making were represented alongside the voices of certified scientists. Interestingly, the latter are showing growing willingness to blog for a range of reasons, including the way in which political, corporate, and consumerist discourses are contesting the weight of scientific evidence through the media. Credentialed scientific expertise, which is the form of expertise that formally trained scientists possess, is one of the key cultural concepts at the heart of the Internet corpus. Indeed, expertise was one of the topics driving the compilation of the Internet collection as a thematic corpus. But our interests were not confined to the study of linguistic patternings involving the term expertise. So the design of the corpus also sought to facilitate the study of competing expertise discourses used in various Internet sites. To achieve this goal, the texts included in the Internet corpus had to incorporate a range of stances and perspectives on scientific expertise as a site of controversy, as I will explain in a couple of minutes. So this case study focuses on climate science as one of many contested scientific domains where the changing politics of expertise are having a profound impact on the production of techno-scientific evidence. Competing views on how to manage the trade-off between the economy and public health, or whether to strengthen regulations of lobbying activity by different stakeholders or interested groups, are only two examples of factors that have contributed to turning climate science into a site of ideological and political polarization. Against this backdrop, climate science blogs have emerged as a productive genre to study competing stances on expertise for various reasons. To begin with, research shows that blogs are consolidating increasingly polarized publics rather than, as Metcalfe says, rather than fostering deliberation across groups driven by mutually opposing agendas. As a genre, climate change blogs are particularly attractive, recent research says, to readers who prefer news outlets where they expect to find culturally congruent arguments about climate change that are consistent with their cultural way of life and their outlook on the world generally. And also, climate change debates held in online public arenas between scientific expert bloggers and their readers have a significant impact, again, research has shown, on people's understanding of climate change, their perception of the risks involved, the value judgments they make, and the emotional reactions that they experience. So this case study of the Anglophone Climate Science Blogosphere aimed to gain a better understanding of the discourse processes through which climate knowledge is being conveyed, and traditional forms of scientific expertise are legitimized or delegitimized. My case study interrogated a collection of posts on climate change drawn from 5 blogs, a subset of the Genealogies of Knowledge Internet corpus that I refer to as the Climate Science Blogger Corpus. The selection of blogs was guided by 3 main criteria. They all adopt a clear and explicit stance on the climate change controversy. They represent various blogging agendas in terms of motivation and the individual or collective authorship of those outlets. And very importantly, the blog authors granted consent for the inclusion of their posts in the Internet corpus. So the climate change blogger corpus consists of approximately 450,000 tokens, so it's a very small corpus, extracted from 5 blogs that explore climate change issues in the UK, the US, and Australia. The weighting of the climate change contrarian and climate change acceptor subsets is rather uneven in the corpus, with the contrarian blog the contrarian blogs making up approximately 20% of the total. There were various reasons for this, not least the fact that, at least in our experience, contrarian bloggers and right-wing activists in general have been much more reluctant to grant authorization, the kind of authorization we require to include the texts in our corpus. In trying to capture varied shades of opinion along the spectrum between the 2 polar extremes of the climate change debate, I relied on the categorization of expertise put forward by proponents of studies of expertise and experience, which is a disciplinary domain that is also referred to in the literature as the 3rd wave of science studies. The taxonomy of expertise, so the taxonomy proposed by scholars working in studies of expertise and experience, is grounded in the premise that policy making in controversial domains of science should not be informed exclusively by formally accredited evidence. In other words, the knowledge produced by formally trained or what they typically call consensus scientists. Instead, it recognizes that citizens and stakeholders with relevant experience should be involved in decision-making where science intersects with the political domain. In other words, this conceptualization of expertise accepts the blurring of the distinction between science and society and acknowledges the central role that citizen participation and social judgments play in environmental governance. However, unlike scholars associated with the 2nd wave of science studies, 3rd wave scholars argue that it is necessary to distinguish the scientific and technical input to decision-making from the political. So, under what they call the realist model of expertise, the proponents of the 3rd wave distinguish between core and experience-based experts. So core experts are those scientists who have actually done relevant experiments, who have developed or worked with relevant theories, in this case, theories pertaining to climate science. By contrast, the label experience-based expert is used to refer to, for example, political lobbyists, journalists, or specialists in any other areas of science. they will have acquired various degrees of specialist expertise by immersing themselves in the climate change community and going through processes of so-called enculturation. By contrast, what we find in this classification is that there is a subdivision under experience-based experts, and one of the subcategories is that of contributory expertise. So when experience-based experts go through sustained and rigorous processes of enculturation and accrue meaningful experience to contribute to climate science, they are said to hold contributory expertise. And on the other hand, when experience-based experts are able to understand scientific things and to discuss scientific things, but they are not able to do scientific things, they are said to possess interactional expertise. So as proponents of the realist model of expertise claim, it is possible to acquire interactional expertise without mastering or even experiencing the physical practices that define, in the case of this study, the domain of climate science expertise. So going back to the composition of the corpus, the contrarian set blogs include Australian Climate Madness. This blog is run by Simon Turnill, an engineer and lawyer by training who makes claims to contributory and interactional expertise and boasts the capacity to offer more reliable reportage on climate change matters than specialist journalists. He calls for the need to, and I quote, review the evidence for and against anthropogenic global warming dispassionately. And he expresses concerns about what he calls the politicization of the scientific process by, among others, the Australian government and mainstream media, which, in his view, is skewing the results of climate science. A second contrarian blog is Science Defies Politics. This is run by Leo Goldstein, an author, startup founder, mathematician, and cybersecurity expert. He's concerned over what he calls the pseudoscience of climate alarmism in the US, results from what he perceives as the country's rapid intellectual degeneration, which has been specially pronounced, as he says, in science and has coincided with the erosion of the basic freedoms that have existed in the country for more than 200 years. Goldstein lays a claim to the possession of interactional and contributory expertise by claiming to have created his blog with the goal of using scientific and technological knowledge, applying the scientific method, and being non-partisan and non-political in this order. The third of the contrarian blogs is Climate Depot, which presents itself as a US-based information clearinghouse and a one-stop shop for reporters, policymakers, student scientists, and concerned scientists. And it allows them to get the latest information on global warming and other environmental and energy issues. In practice, however, this whole blog is about the work of Mark Morano, its executive director, who used to be a former communication operations leader for Republican politicians in the past. He claims to hold a certain degree of interactional expertise, and indeed he enjoys very high visibility in American mainstream media for its outstanding capacity to fuel climate change skepticism in the US. On the other hand, there are two outlets under the acceptor subset. One of them is The Smog UK, launched in 2014 to expose lobbying and spin around climate change and other environmental issues. The journalists and researchers blogging through The Smog UK seek to fight climate change misinformation by drawing on facts and hard evidence in order to, and I quote, clear the PR pollution that clouds climate science. Researchers and journalists posting on this blog make use of their experience-based expertise, both interactional and contributory, to stand up for scientific evidence as a means to protect our political institutions and public processes of deliberation from the interference of corporate lobbying. So they make a very strong connection between what's happening with attacks on climate science and attacks on democracy more generally. Finally, the blog of the US Union of Concerned Scientists is largely a product of past and current tensions between the US scientists in their capacity as core experts and the White House administration. The blog's remit is to use rigorous, independent science to solve our planet's most pressing problems. Effectively, the blog acts as a virtual advocacy network driven by an activist agenda under which American core experts, including scientists, communication specialists, and policy analysts, are organizing protests, educating the public, and, in their own words, shaming their local governments and national representatives into action. So, to catch traces of how competing forms of expertise are contested or endorsed in the corpus, I have drawn on Martin and White's concept of engagement. Adopting a social dialogic perspective, the notion of engagement is about how speakers and writers anticipate potential reactions from other interlocutors who may choose to articulate contentious or controversial positions on the issue under discussion. So, as Martin and White put it, the notion of engagement includes all those locutions which provide the means for the authorial voice to position itself with respect to, and hence to engage with, the other voices and alternative positions construed as being in play in the current communicative context. For the purposes of this study, I chose to focus on lexical realizations of dialogic engagement, an area which, according to Viva 2006, has received far less attention than grammatical realizations of engagement. Further, I concentrated on the study of what Martin and White call dialogically contractive lexis, defined as structures that challenge, fend off, or restrict the scope of alternative positions and voices within ongoing debates. So specifically, I looked at pronouncing items that, according to Martin and White, allow for the expression of subjectivity while implying the presence of some resistance, some contrary pressure of doubt or challenge against which the authorial voice asserts itself. Out of the range of lexical items meeting an additional set of selection criteria, my study focused on the bloggers' use of terms like bias and biases, dogma and peer review. And today, because of time constraints, I'll be reporting briefly on the analysis of biases. So this metafacet visualization, and Henry and Jan have very capably explained what a metafacet visualization is and what it shows. So this visualization for a concordance of 102 occurrences of bias and biases in the Climate Science Blogger Corpus reveals that those tokens are used in 4 of the 5 blogs included in my corpus. Now, remember that the size of the acceptor subset is approximately 4 times the size of the contrarian subset. So the fact that we have as many occurrences in the contrarian subset as we have in the acceptor one means that obviously the term bias and biases happens in the contrarian set much more often in proportional terms. So one of the other visualizations developed as part of the Genealogies of Knowledge project is the mosaic. In this type of visualization, the search word appears surrounded by tiles featuring other lexical items involved in relationships of co-occurrence or collocation with the search word, measured to different degrees of collocational strength. So the mosaic you have there shows the co-text for the terms bias and biases in the contrarian outlets. So an analysis of those lexical items featuring in the co-text show that contrarian outlets tend to label biases relating to climate change science as, for example, pro-alarmist, or attribute them to the warmist stance associated with scientific consensus. The term warmist is also there in the mosaic, but I should perhaps note that when you, like in this case, are looking at a screenshot of a mosaic, opposed to using it within the Corpus interface, you cannot enlarge the size of what at the moment appear as smaller tiles. Contrarian outlets also present biases as intentional and hence partisan. Crucially, contrarian outlets are keen to expose the institutionalized nature of biases in major organizations and corporations, some of which, like Google or the IPCC, are captured in the mosaic. The contrarian authorial voice also seeks to assert itself against what it perceives as the ideological and political nature of climate change biases, which are framed as anti-conservative or anti-American or heavy leftists, which is another term that is not captured, I seem to remember, in this particular mosaic. A search for the term bias in the acceptor subcorpus, on the other hand, returns 38 concordance lines where bias or biases are used as nouns. The scrutiny of collocates feature in the mosaic visualization of this subcorpus indicates that a significant number of the occurrences of bias and biases in the acceptor subset can be observed in discussions of scientific methodology. So, for example, bias is associated with data sets, or they are also associated with references to research equipment, which are not captured in one of the big tiles of the mosaic. But so here is one example, one of the expanded examples from a concordance line, taken from the Union of Concerned Scientists blog. So NOAA scientists were using the scientific method to identify the bias that exists in temperature measuring instruments and making their data more accurate by taking this bias into account. So there are more references to instruments and measures and so on. And another example, this time from Desmog UK. Each instant of the presumed onset was not randomly chosen, but chosen specifically because of the low subsequent warming. We describe this as selection bias. Some of the biases that affect the data sets and projections were known or knowable at the time. So as you can see, there's that connection between biases and different aspects of the research method and instruments. Biases in the acceptor corpus is also connected with research metrics. For example, in terms of the contrast that they establish between bias efficiency and mean media approaches, and also connected with the scientific publication infrastructure and systems. And of particular note is the role that industry-funded research plays in the production of biased climate change in the eyes of acceptor bloggers. So both camps make use of pronouncing items, lexical items like bias or biases, to acknowledge the diversity of approaches to the study of climate change. And they both try to construct a coherent authorial voice to challenge the biased nature of the dialogical alternative at play. However, these accusations of bias are articulated differently in each subcorpus, and this is what I'll address in the next couple of minutes to wrap up. The use of selective pronouncing lexes like bias by contrarian actors to negotiate their positioning within the blogosphere reveals a fundamental mismatch between some of their declared intentions and their actual authorial voices as bloggers. So as you will remember from my previous explanation, contrarian bloggers present themselves as endowed with the cultural competence required to master interactional and contributory expertise in the field of climate science. They claim to be driven by the need to assess evidence for and against climate change dispassionately as a way to uphold the integrity of relevant documents. However, the analysis of this subcorpus shows that in positioning themselves with respect to the acceptor's stance, contrarian bloggers resort to characterizing mainstream scientific consensus precisely in terms of the alignment of acceptor bloggers with institutional policies, corporate interests, or left-wing agendas at odds with national interests. So they try to foreground the politicization, different ways, politicization in consensus science. The emphasis that contrarian bloggers place on the ideological dimension of the biases, sort of biases that underpin mainstream climate change endorsed by institution and corporation, has to do with their use of values in an indirect role. Used in an indirect role, values in the voices and texts of contrarian bloggers are used to undermine the final stages of the research process, to raise uncertainty about the quantity and the epistemology of the evidence produced by core experts. So by exposing what they perceive as the centrality of biases in consensus climate science, the stance of contrarian bloggers becomes imbued with political overtones, which facilitates the derivation and communication of their skeptic perspective. By contrast, acceptor voices seek to legitimize their own stand by foregrounding the unsavory sources of contrarian science funding and the weaknesses of the methods and protocols used by climate change deniers. As the examples have shown, the biases identified by acceptor bloggers refer primarily to the consequences of ill-informed conceptual or methodological decisions and of skewed calibration and measurements while gathering evidence. In other words, scientific biases are presented as relatively unintentional consequences of non-partisan exercises of agency. In other words, the analysis shows that acceptor bloggers are normally bound by values used in a direct role. Used in a direct role, values, according to Douglas, act as the reasons why experts accept a given set of premises, draw upon scientific theory, or declare that the evidence available to substantiate a claim is insufficient. Consequently, they are more likely to mobilize epistemic values circumscribed by the methodological norms of the certified scientific community. So it is with this contrastive use of values in each of the subcorpora of the climate change blog corpus that I'll stop and address any questions that you may have if there's still anybody there. Thank you very much.